This is the continuation of the Classical Theatre Company's A Christmas Carol. It was written by Charles Dickens. This adaptation was produced by the Classical Theatre Company, Johnston, artistic director. It was adapted by Mr. Johnston and Matthew Keenan, and it was directed by Philip Hayes. In it, you will hear James Belcher, Brittny Bush, Greg Cote, Adam Gibbs, Chip Simmons, Lisa Villegas, and me, Tom Pryor. The sound design was done by John Harvey, with visualizations by Jeff McMorrough. This is part 2, The First Two Spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. So he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped.
"12. It was past 2 when I went to bed. The clock is wrong. An icicle must have gotten into the works. 12. Why, it isn't possible that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon.
All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. Scrooge thought and thought and thought it over and over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through.
Was it a dream or not?
Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more, when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length, it broke upon his listening ear.
A quarter past? Half past? A quarter to it? The hour itself. And nothing else.
Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. And Scrooge, starting up in a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past.
What is your business here?
Your welfare.
I'm much obliged, but I would think a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end.
Your reclamation, then. Take heed. Rise and walk with me.
It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes. That bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, but he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication.
I am mortal and liable to fall.
The spirit laid its hand on Scrooge's heart.
Bear but a touch of my hand there, and you shall be upheld in more than this.
As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day, with snow upon the ground.
Good heaven! I was bred in this place. I was a boy here.
He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten.
Your lip is trembling. And what is that upon your cheek?
Nothing. Lead me where you will.
You recollect the way?
Remember it. I could walk it blindfold.
Strange, to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go on.
They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river.
Merry Christmas.
Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them with the boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers.
Good morning.
All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it.
These are but shadows of things that have been. They have no consciousness of us.
Why did his cold eye glisten and heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge?
Out upon Merry Christmas.
What good had it ever done to him?
The school is not quite deserted. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still.
I know it.
They left the high road by a well-remembered lane and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. There was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading.
Poor boy. I wish, but it's too late now.
What is the matter?
Nothing. Nothing. There was a child singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all.
Let us see another Christmas.
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked lathes were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. Then the door opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and putting her arms about his neck and often kissing him.
Dear, dear brother! I have come to bring you home, dear brother. To bring you home, home.
Home, little fan?
Home, for good and all. Home, for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, and are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world.
Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart.
So she had. You're right. I will not gainsay it, Spirit. God forbid.
She died a woman, and had, as I think, children.
One child.
True. Your nephew.
Yes.
Then a fog beguiled their way, and all they had but that moment left the school behind them. They were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressings of the shop, that here too it was Christmas time again, but it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door.
Do you know this door?
Know it? I was apprenticed here.
They went in, at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement,
Yo-ho there, Ebenezer. Yo-ho, my boy. No more work tonight. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the room cleared before a man can say Jack Robinson. Hilly-ho, clear away, my lad. Let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Ebenezer.
Clear away? There was nothing he or any of the apprentices wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night.
In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches.
In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile.
In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable.
In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke.
In came all the young men and women employed in the business.
In came the housemaid and her cousin, the baker.
In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman.
In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master,
trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door but one, who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress.
In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow, and away they all went.
I saw 3 ships come sailing in on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. I saw 3 ships come sailing in on Christmas Day in the morning. And what was in those ships, all 3 on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day? And what was in those ships, all 3 on Christmas Day in the morning? Savior Christ and his lady on Christmas Day, on Christmas Day. Our Savior Christ and his lady on Christmas Day in the morning.
Well done.
There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was punch, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer.
Hey!
Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners. People who were not to be trifled with. People who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now that he remembered the ghost and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear.
A small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude.
Small?
Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?
It isn't that. It isn't that, Spirit. He had the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add or count them up. What then? Well, the happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune.
What is the matter?
Nothing particular.
Something, I think.
No. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all.
My time grows short. Quick.
This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again the fog came and went, and Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past.
It matters little. To you, Ebenezer, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve.
What idol has displaced you?
A golden one.
This is the even-handed dealing of the world. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth.
You fear the world too much. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion gain engrosses you. Have I not?
What then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. Am I?
Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man.
I was a boy.
Your own feeling tells you that you were not what you are. I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it, and can release you.
Have I ever sought release?
In words? No, never.
In what then?
In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us, tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? Ah, no.
You think not?
I would gladly think otherwise if I could. Heaven knows. When I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You, who in your very confidence with her weigh everything by gain? Or, choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do. And I release you, with a full heart, for the love of him that you once were. You may. The memory of what is past half makes me hope you will have pain in this. A very, very brief time. And you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen.
Spirit, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?
One shadow more.
No more. No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more.
But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene and place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his fireside. And when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed.
Belle, I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon.
Who was it?
Guess.
How can I? Oh, tut, don't I know? Oh, Mr. Scrooge.
Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe.
Spirit, remove me from this place.
I told you these were shadows of the things that have been. They are what they are. Do not blame me.
Remove me. I cannot bear it. Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer.
In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle, in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger, dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at that very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it. It would unquestionably have done it too. At last, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock,
Ebenezer Scrooge! Enter!
it was his own room.
There was no doubt about that.
But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright, gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, poultry, mince pies, plum puddings, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door.
Come in. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me.
Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle, bordered with white fur. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air.
You have never seen the like of me before.
Never.
Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born these later years?
I don't think I have. I am afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1,800.
Tremendous family to provide for. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Ah. Touch my robe.
The room vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeepers' benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. Grocers, nearly closed, with perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses. The blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from the highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress. But the customers were also hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter and came running back to fetch them and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humor possible. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. The sight of those poor revelers appeared to interest the Spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. It was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was.
Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?
There is. My own.
Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?
To any kindly given. To a poor one most.
Why to a poor one most?
Because it needs it most.
Spirit, I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment.
Aye.
You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all. Wouldn't you?
Aye.
You seek to close these places on the seventh day. And it comes to the same thing.
I seek.
Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family.
There are some upon this earth of yours who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us.
I will do so.
They went on, invisible as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe. And on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of his torch.
What has ever got your precious father then, Peter? And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour.
Here's Martha, Mother.
Here's Martha, Mother. Hurrah! There's
Why?
goose, Martha.
Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are.
We'd a deal of work to finish up last night and had to clear away this morning, Mother.
Well, never mind, so long as you are come. Sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless you.
No, there's Father coming. Hide, Martha, hide.
So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame.
Why, where's our Martha?
Not coming.
Not coming? Not coming upon Christmas Day?
Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim, bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
And how did little Tim behave?
As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he had hoped people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk, blind men see. Tim is growing strong and hearty.
His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. And while Bob, turning up its cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Oh, there was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us.
God bless us.
God bless us, everyone, said Tiny Tim, the last of all.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, kind spirit. Say he will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population.
Wow.
Man, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh, God! To hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust.
Mr. Scrooge. I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast, indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
My dear, the children. Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care tuppence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the baleful being done with. The chestnuts and the jug went round and by and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner. And nothing grew but moss and furze, coarse rank grass. Down in the west, the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night.
What place is this?
A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth. But they know me. See!
A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud. And so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither? Not to sea? To sea. built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed. The wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire that through their loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their calloused hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog. And one of them struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on, until, being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any other day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known what they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it at his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability.
Christmas was a humbug, as I live. He believed it too.
More shame for him,
Said
Fred.
Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head.
He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him.
I'm sure he is very rich, Fred. At least you always tell me so.
Of that, my dear. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking he is ever going to benefit us with it.
I have no patience with him.
Oh, I have? I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us, and what's the consequence? You don't lose much of a dinner.
Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner.
What do, you say, Topper?
I am a wretched outcast of a bachelor and have no right to express an opinion on the subject.
Do go on, Fred. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow.
I was only going to say that the consequence of his taking dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, well, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper, year after year, and saying, "Uncle Scrooge, how are you?" If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday.
After a while, they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. There was first a game at blind man's buff. Of course there was.
Please, Spirit, may I be allowed to stay until the guests depart?
It cannot be done.
A new game.
Here's a new game, Spirit, only one.
So be it.
Let's play yes and no. I must think of something, and the rest of you must find out what it is. I can only answer your questions with yes or no, as the case may be.
Is it an animal?
Yes.
Is it a live animal?
Yes.
Is it a disagreeable animal?
Yes.
A savage animal?
Yes.
Does it growl and grunt?
Sometimes. Yes.
Can it talk?
Yes.
Does it live in London?
Does, yes.
Is it led by someone through the streets?
No.
A horse?
No.
An ass.
No.
A dog?
A pig?
No.
A cat.
No.
A cow.
A bull?
No.
A bear?
A
No.
tiger.
I have found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is.
Is it?
It's your Uncle Scrooge.
Yes, it's so.
You ought to have said yes when I asked if it was a bear.
No.
Oh, he has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure. And it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment. And I say, Uncle Scrooge.
Well, Uncle Scrooge.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge!
Thank you. Thank you all.
Then the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. Spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together.
My time is drawing near.
Are spirits' lives so short?
My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight.
Tonight?
Tonight at midnight. Hark!
Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?
It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it. Look here.
From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment.
Oh, man! Look here. Look! Look! Down here!
They were a boy and girl. Yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade, through all the mysteries of wonderful creation, as monsters half so horrible and dread.
Spirit, are they yours?
They are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it! Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse. And bide the end.
Have they no refuge or resource?
Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?
Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and, lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming, like a mist along the ground, towards him. This has been part 2 of the Classical Theatre Company's A Christmas Carol. Join us on December 23rd for part 3, the end of it.